Well, hey, good morning and welcome to Christ Church, a church about lifting lives, elevating Christ, a church for those who aren't here yet. My name is Pastor Mike. I'm one of the pastors here on staff, and it is so good to be with you this morning, whether you're joining us here in the West Auditorium, whether you're joining us over in East, or you're joining us online this morning. It is just good for us to be in worship together. As we come into our Christmas season, we began a new series last week called Ghosts of Christmas Past. And we know that for many of you, the Christmas season brings a time of great joy in which you're able to gather with your family, to celebrate, and to make these lasting memories with your family that end up continuing to be the strength of your life and get you through the whole year. And yet, for many of us, the Christmas season can be really difficult. That often during this time, it feels like there are ghosts that are haunting our holidays. That there are things that we've done in our past, there are relationships that are on the rocks that create a situation where the holidays are not always the happiest for everyone. And sometimes the thing that haunts our holidays is not the things that we have done or the things that have happened to us, but sometimes it is merely the absence of someone that we love and care about. Sometimes when we gather with family, sometimes it is the empty chair that speaks the loudest at the table. Whether it is somebody who has passed away in the most recent year, or maybe it's the first holiday that you have to have without your kids after a messy divorce. Sometimes the moments in which we notice the person who is not there continues to haunt us and weigh heavy on our hearts, even more so than the joy that is brought by the people who are there. And we recognize this at Christ Church, which is why we each year have a service of remembrance for those who have experienced loss and are working their way through grief in the holiday season. So we invite you tomorrow night to come on back to Christ Church, that our care director, Amy Eberman, puts together an amazing night that helps people navigate grief during the holiday season. And the reason that we have to talk about this is that this marks our Christmas story, believe it or not. That Jesus' story at Christmas time still has ghosts that haunt the past and also have these moments of intense grief and loss in his ancestry. And it is in those stories of grief and loss experienced by Jesus' ancestors that still echo into the Christmas story today. The last week we began digging into Jesus' genealogy and talking about some of those important stories that inform who Jesus is and what his family was like before he came. And it is also this sense of these stories of grief and loss experienced by Jesus' ancestors that echo into our story as well. That they help inform the ways that we navigate not having loved ones around with us and how we respond faithfully to God and to the people around us. So like I said, last week we started digging into the genealogy of Jesus that Matthew, one of Jesus' disciples who wrote a firsthand account of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection, begins his Christmas story in a weird way. That he begins it by accounting for all of Jesus' ancestors going all the way back to Abraham, which spans 49 generations, that's a lot. And so what's really interesting, though, and something that I mentioned last week, is that there are 4 women who are named in Jesus' genealogy. And with each of these 4 women, there is a profound story that may not make a lot of sense to us initially, but would have had deep meaning to the Israelite people who were trying to understand who Jesus is and where Jesus came from. And one of those stories is with Ruth. That in Matthew 1:5, it says, Boaz was the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth. Obed was the father of Jesse, and Jesse was the father of King David. That in this story of Ruth, there is a story of grief and loss, but also profound faithfulness that continues to echo into our Christmas story today. And so I want to tell this story, and I know that some of you that have been with us for a while, we talked about Ruth not too long ago, that about a year and a half ago in our God of the Underdog series, we did talk about the story of Ruth. If you want to have a different perspective on that story, I invite you to go back and listen. But if you did hear it, just enjoy the retelling of it now. So Ruth's story begins this way, that Ruth lived a long time ago before King David in the time of the judges, so after the Exodus, but before the time of the kings. And it says, in the days when the judges ruled in Israel, a severe famine came upon the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah left his home and went to live in the country of Moab, taking his wife and 2 sons with him. Now, the first thing that I want you to notice at the beginning of this story is that we begin to get our first Christmas echo with this town of Bethlehem, of which we often sing about as the place as Jesus' birth. You see, Bethlehem has deep meaning and deep history within Jesus' family and ancestry. And the thing about Bethlehem is that in Hebrew, the word Bethlehem is Bet Lechem, which is the house of bread or the house of food. And so one of the things that the ancient Hebrews would have instantly noticed about this story is the deep irony that this man who lives in the house of bread doesn't have anything to eat, that they are experiencing a severe famine and need to leave and go somewhere else to find food. And the place that they go to, again, would have had deep meaning to the Israelite people, that they go to the country of Moab. Now, the Moabites were distant cousins of the Israelites of sorts. Like, they trace their lineage back to a common ancestor, but for hundreds of years up until this point, they had not gotten along very well. That there was a lot of tension between Moabites and Israelites, such that it would have taken a significant amount of setting aside this man's pride to say, I have to leave my place where I'm born to go to this place where I don't like the people and the people don't like me, just so that I can support my family and we can find food. And so this man from Bethlehem, the man's name was Elimelech, and his wife was Naomi. Their 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion, and they were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in the land of Judah. And when they reached Moab, they settled there. Now here is the first moment in which disaster strikes the family. It says, then once they reached there, Elimelech died, and Naomi was left with her 2 sons. The 2 sons married Moabite women. One married a woman named Orpah, and the other a woman named Ruth. And just for clarity's sake, Orpah marries Chilion, and Ruth marries Mahlon. And so instantly, Naomi gets to this foreign land that she's only going to because they can't find food, and her husband passes away. And then to make matters worse, it says about 10 years later, both Mahlon and Chilion died. This left Naomi alone, without her 2 sons or her husband. I think we need to pause a moment to appreciate and to dwell in the deep grief that Naomi must have felt in this moment. Here she is, a woman in a foreign land, disconnected from all of her family and neighbors that she knew growing up. And here she is without her husband. And even worse, perhaps the most painful thing any person can experience, she has to bury both of her sons. And in the story, neither of her 2 sons, even though they got married, neither of them have had children yet. And so she's not even a grandma. There is nobody left with a direct lineage to her in this world. The only 2 people left are Orpah and Ruth, her daughter-in-laws, who are foreign Moabite women. And I think that many of us can relate to Naomi's situation, unfortunately. That many of us have had the unfortunate circumstance of having to bury someone we love, whether it's a parent or a spouse or a child. Many of us have felt the immense grief and feeling like we are in this pit that we cannot climb out of, that we are surrounded in darkness and we just don't want to move forward anymore. That our grief becomes paralyzing and we have no idea where God is and how we could possibly move forward. Now, It is my deep belief that it is not always the responsibility of the person who is experiencing grief and pain and loss for them to get themselves out of this situation. Sometimes we call it bootstrapping, and I am not a fan of insisting that it is the work of the person who is grieving to do all the work to help restore them to a place of joy and peace. And yet, I find that it is really tempting when we are the person that is experiencing grief and loss to sometimes intentionally disconnect from God and from God's people. Sometimes when we are at the depths and in the darkest moments in our life and feel like God hates us and nothing could ever bring us out of this intense sadness, it is so easy for us to sometimes say, God, you stay over there and I'm going to stay over here. And we stop praying and we stop coming to church and we stop surrounding us with the people who care about us and who are able to speak comfort and help take care of us in our lives. And it's really tempting to want to go into that place, but it is a place that begets even more darkness. And so we have to ask ourselves, what does it faithfully mean to respond to loss? That when we experience grief and experience deeply the absence of the people that we love in our lives, how do we faithfully respond to these moments? And this is where we get deep encouragement from the story of Ruth and Naomi, which is that it is in Ruth's remarkable faithfulness to Naomi that both of them are able to experience redemption that in this darkest moment they probably were not able to see for themselves. You see, Naomi no longer has blood connections to either of these two women, that she is not tied by marriage or blood to Orpah or Ruth. And so when she finally hears that there is food back in Israel and that the crops are good again, she decides to go back home. And initially, Orpah and Ruth begin to follow her, but as they get going a little bit further, out of a sense of love, Naomi tries to push both of them away. That she says, look, you should go back to your families from where you came from, be with your people, and they will be able to take care of you because I cannot take care of you. And to the credit of both women, they both say, no, we are going to stand by your side. To which then Naomi responds, look, think about it logically. There is no way that I can provide for you, that even if I were to get married and then have a son, what are you going to do? Are you going to wait for that son to grow up and then marry that son so that you can claim the inheritance of my family? It's ridiculous. You don't want to do that. The smart thing for you is to go back to your family and go back to your people. And Orpah is convinced by this logic, and none of us should think less of Orpah for doing so, that she is doing the thing that makes sense, and she tearfully gives Naomi a hug and says goodbye. But Ruth does something incredible. Ruth replies to Naomi by saying, don't ask me to leave you and turn back. Wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you live, I will live. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. I think that this is astounding, that I don't know how many of you have such a good relationship with your mother-in-law that if everybody else in your family passed away, that you would be able to stick by them as faithfully as Ruth has in this moment. And so for Ruth, this Moabite woman, to say, look, I'm going to follow you wherever you go, and I'm going to worship your God, that I trust and I have faith in your God. And so we can take heart that it is in the face of loss that Ruth remains faithful to Naomi and to God. That Ruth's response to grief and loss is not to wallow in self-pity, but to say, I am going to stick by this woman who I care about, and I'm going to continue to praise the God that she praises. And so they end up returning to Bethlehem in Judah. And as they do so, people see Naomi and they say, Naomi, could it really be you? We've missed you. It's been at least 10 years or more since we've seen you. And Naomi says, no, I don't go by Naomi anymore. Instead, call me Mara, which means bitter, because that is what my life has become, just a series of bitterness after bitterness. Which gives us some evidence from the story that while Ruth is trying to keep her head up and trying to be optimistic, Naomi is still grieving. That she is still feeling bitter about the loss in her life and is difficult for her to carry on, which makes it even more important that Ruth decides to walk alongside her. And not only is Ruth walking alongside her mother-in-law, but Ruth ends up being the one who ends up providing for the both of them. That when they get to Bethlehem, Ruth goes out into the fields and comes upon the field of this man named Boaz. And what was happening at the time is she was doing this practice called gleaning, which is to say that she was picking up the scraps and the leftovers after the harvesters had come through. So Boaz's workers in the field, they would come through, they would harvest the grain, and there would be leftovers, some scraps, things that they missed. And then Ruth and other people would come around with a basket and they would pick up the scraps, collect them for themselves, and then go home and make bread with what little they were able to collect. Now, this is our first sign, in fact, that Boaz is a righteous man who is following God's commandments. That this idea, like if you were an efficient businessman, you probably would not want to leave any grain on the table, right? You would have your harvesters go through, and then you'd have a second crew that would come back and sweep up all the leftovers, and that way you would maximize the output from your fields. And yet, there is a law that comes from the book of Deuteronomy that Boaz would have been familiar with that says when you are harvesting your crops and forget to bring in a bundle of grain from your field, don't go back to get it. Leave it for the foreigners, orphans, and widows. Then the Lord your God will bless you in all that you do. You see, this is exactly the situation that Ruth finds herself in as both a widow and a foreigner, somebody who is economically destitute, financially impoverished. And Boaz shows faith in God and God's laws and mercy to the people who are working in his field that he allows these women to come and pick up the scraps from his field so that they can eat. Now, Boaz sees the hardworking Moabite woman, Ruth, and he asks his foreman, he says, "Who is this woman who is working in the field?" And the foreman goes, "Well, that is Ruth, the Moabite woman. She came here with Naomi." Part of the backstory is that Boaz is related, probably a nephew or a second cousin of Elimelech, Naomi's former husband. And so there is some family ties here, but it's a very loose family connection. And Boaz decides to meet this Ruth individual, and in modern rom-com vernacular, they have kind of what's called a meet cute, in which there is a moment in which Boaz says, "Hey, I see what you're doing, that I see that you are being faithful to Naomi, that you are hardworking and industrious. If you stay in my field, I will make sure that not only do the foremen and the other men who are working not harass you, but that you will be protected and provided for, and you will always be welcome in my field." And Ruth kind of gets this moment of relief of saying, wow, somebody is watching out for me and somebody is caring for me. And she goes home and she tells Naomi this story of what Boaz said to her, and Naomi, being very perceptive, is like, "Whoop, I know what's going on here. I think he likes you." And so here's what you're going to do. And because Boaz is related to us, he could be our family redeemer. He could be the person that helps restore us and bring us into his house that we might find security and family again. And so this concept of the family redeemer is one that has deep biblical roots, something that we don't really have in our culture, but would have been very familiar to the Israelites. That back in Leviticus, there is an admonition to landowners and property owners that there is a way for people who have come into poverty to get their land back. That we don't really think We think of things as like finders, keepers, losers, weepers in the U.S., but for them, there was always a way for people to inherit and buy back their historic family land. And it says that if one of your fellow Israelites falls into poverty and is forced to sell some family land, then a close relative should buy it back for him. He then has the right to redeem it from the one who bought it. And Naomi sees this opportunity for Boaz to become this redeemer who buys back the family land that her and Elimelech had sold. And so she devises this plan for Ruth and Boaz to get together. And so they meet up in the middle of the night, and there's like a little like, I'm sorry, I don't know why I did that. You get the idea though. But anyway, so they get together, and Ruth asks Boaz to be their family redeemer. And Boaz agrees, but there's a problem. There's one other person who has claim to their family land. And so Boaz devises this way for him to be able to go through all the proper protocol in their culture, but still become the family redeemer. And so he invites this man who is actually a closer relative to Elimelech to meet him out in public where everybody can see, and says, hey, you know that Naomi is back in town, and you are the closest kinsman redeemer to her, which gives you the right, if you so choose, to buy Elimelech's former land, the land which they sold. And presumably you can probably get a really good price for it. And so there's this guy, the closest family redeemer, says, hey, you know what? That sounds like a great idea. I could buy this land. I could increase my estate. This is going to be awesome. But this is where Boaz is really clever. And you'll notice that Boaz is carrying a flip-flop here. That actually comes back in the story in just a second. But Boaz says, of course, you can purchase the land from Naomi, but it also requires that you marry Ruth, the Moabite widow. That way, she can have children who will carry on her husband's name and keep the land in the family. I don't know if you are catching what's going on here, but technically, if this other family redeemer were to marry Ruth and have a child, the firstborn son would actually carry on the family name of Elimelech and Mahlon, and not of this other family redeemer. And so the guy goes, no, then I can't redeem it, he replied, because this might endanger my own estate. That would be an incredible sacrifice for me to purchase this land that may end up dividing the own inheritance that I'm able to give my children. So he says, you redeem the land instead. I cannot do it. And the way that they seal this deal and make sure that everybody in town knows that he is passing up the opportunity to buy Naomi's land and give it to Boaz is that they exchange flip-flops. Kind of weird, but that's how they do business. And so Boaz is often depicted with a sandal in his hand in art and literature. And so there is this happy ending story that Boaz is willing to make this sacrifice for Ruth, that he doesn't care about his estate being divided up. Instead, he has compassion for both Ruth and Naomi and marries Ruth and brings Naomi into his household. And eventually, Ruth has a child. And the love that Naomi has for this child, who now, remember, has no blood connection to her, that this is Elimelech's cousin, and so she is not related to this child at all, doesn't share any blood with Ruth, and yet this is her grandchild. This is the baby that she loves and fawns and adores over. And the women of the town said to Naomi, praise the Lord who has now provided a redeemer for your family. May this child be famous in Israel. The neighbor women said, now at last Naomi has a son again. And they named him Obed, and he became the father of Jesse and the grandfather of King David. You see, even in the middle of grief and loss, in the middle of hopelessness, God brought redemption both in this life and into the future for Naomi and for Ruth and for their family. That even after significant loss, God did not forget about them. God did not abandon them, but provided them a future, one of redemption in which they were able to have a family again, to be secure financially again. And God worked through the family of this foreign Moabite woman, of this people detested by the Israelites, and not only brought about King David, but brought about Jesus, our Messiah and Savior of the world. You see, this story echoes into the Christmas story in, I think, 3 different ways. And the first I just kind of mentioned is that in the genealogy, it says that Boaz was the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth. Obed was the father of Jesse, and Jesse was the father of King David. And then there is another 14 generations until we get to Jacob, who was the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary. And Mary gave birth to Jesus, who is called the Messiah. That God's redemptive work meant that there was healing and restoration and joy to be had in Naomi's future, in Ruth's future, and in the future of Naomi's people. That eventually the Messiah would be brought through her line. And I think there's 2 other ways that this story echoes into the future, into our Christmas story. And one of the ways that we don't often think about is that this profound sense of loss that is experienced by Naomi and Ruth has probably also been experienced by Mary and Jesus. That they knew what it was to suffer loss and grief. You see, Joseph features prominently in our Christmas story, but then disappears from Matthew's narrative. He's not featured in Mark's narrative at all, and there's only a glancing reference to Joseph in John's account of Jesus' life. And yet in Luke, the last time we see Joseph is about when Jesus is 12 years old and amazes people in the temple, which leads us to believe that sometime between the time when Jesus was 12 and when he starts his public ministry in his late 20s or early 30s, that his dad has passed away and that Mary is living without her husband, and all she has is her children to hold on to. And it is in this story that we remind ourselves of the humanity of Jesus and of Mary. That whatever loss that we experience in our lives and the grief of losing loved ones, that Jesus, our Messiah, connected to God the Father, creator of the entire universe, knows what it means to feel and experience that same pain and that same grief. That even with this absolute assurance and hope in the future and in heaven, there is still sadness in losing the people that we love. And our God knows and understands what it is to live through that. And the other way that this echoes into our story is that Boaz foreshadows the character of Christ as the family redeemer. Even as this other family member is unwilling to sacrifice himself and his own estate to do the right thing by Naomi and her family, Boaz is willing to sacrifice whatever future inheritance he might be offering. He's risking having a Moabite woman in his house and taking on her mother-in-law as someone that he provides for and supports, but also is unconcerned about the future and willing to sacrifice for them. And it is the same type of redeeming that Christ has for us. That the Apostle Paul puts it this way, that Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us. We are reminded that this baby that comes to us at Christmas time will eventually find himself in a place where there is no sacrifice he is unwilling to make for the redemption of his people. That eventually from the cradle to the cross, Jesus willingly sacrifices himself to redeem us, not only in this life, but in the next one. And this promise is for you too, that no matter what loss or grief you are experiencing in your life, that we experience at the present, through Jesus, God gives us hope for redemption. And I have seen it in the stories of the people who come here to Christ Church, that I have watched the faithfulness of someone who lost a son and has become a fixture on our care team, walking alongside people also experiencing loss. I have watched the ways that people who have gotten through messy divorces and have felt no hope for the future, that they would never get remarried and there would never be a future for them and their kids. I've seen them find hope and joy and find somebody else that loves them completely the way that God intended them. And I have seen men who have been at rock bottom, whose addictions have left them without money and without family, become the type of people who speak Christ into other people's lives, who have not only recovered themselves by God's grace, but then devote their lives to being able to help other people. And it is in these stories that I am so encouraged, knowing that our God is one of redemption and that God will redeem you too. Amen. Let's pray. God, we give you thanks that you are indeed our Redeemer, that Christ is our Redeemer, that you have seen us in our darkest moments, in our places of loss and grief, and you have taken an eye of kindness on us, that you have looked on us with favor and with mercy and said into our lives, look, this is not the end. This is only the beginning, and I have a future for you. God, we give you thanks for the stories of Ruth and Naomi, whose faithfulness in the middle of loss helps encourage us to live faithfully to you and live faithfully to the people around us. May you continue to walk beside us. May your presence fill the people in this space who are staring down an empty chair this Christmas season, and help give them peace. Help them find hope in the middle of sadness, knowing that you are a God of redemption and that you are still working in their lives, both now and until life eternal with you. For all these things, we give you thanks and praise, that we love you and we glorify your name. Amen.